Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about female animals.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting stuff from this book, bitch, um,
Okay.
on the female of the species by Lucy Cooke. And
Interesting.
yeah, it's amazing how much we think we know
Right.
about like what makes a female, but
Yeah.
it's a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than you might think.
And a lot more diverse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
So I thought we could just jump right in and
Good.
maybe start by talking about moles.
Moles. Okay.
Yeah, so, they're not exactly the most glamorous creatures, right?
Oh, no, not really.
But they've got some really incredible adaptations for living underground.
Right. Yeah. Like that velvety fur.
Oh, yeah, the fur is amazing. It helps them move through those tunnels.
Yeah.
And they can smell in stereo, which is
Wow.
pretty wild when you think about it. And they even have venomous saliva.
Really?
I know, right? They use it to paralyze worms.
Wow. So they can like store them for later.
Exactly, like little underground pantries.
That's pretty smart.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Female moles have this organ called an ovotestis.
An overtestis. I've never even heard of that. What is it?
So basically, it's an organ that can produce both eggs, A and D, testosterone.
Whoa. Hold on. So it's like both male and female at the same time.
It really challenges those traditional ideas about what makes a male and what makes a female.
That's incredible. It totally throws those categories out the window.
I know, right? So how does this all play into how we think about the words sex and gender?
Well, when we talk about sex and biology, we're really talking about the size of the reproductive cells, or gametes.
Okay.
So females have those large egg cells, and males have those tiny sperm.
Right.
But gender's a whole other thing.
Okay, so how is gender different?
Gender is really more of a human construct.
Oh, okay.
It's about the roles and behaviors and expectations we associate with being male or female in our society.
Okay, I see. So this mole, with its egg and testosterone-producing organ, is kind of like a walking example of how nature doesn't always fit into our human categories.
Absolutely. And it's not just about this one organ. Cook even describes the female mole as having a penile clitoris.
Wow, a penile clitoris.
Yeah. It really makes you question the whole idea of using genitals as the main way to determine an animal's sex.
Okay, so we've dug around with moles for a bit.
Uh-huh.
Maybe we should move on to another animal.
Okay. Yeah. Who's next?
How about the spotted hyena?
Oh, the hyenas. They're so cool.
I know, right? And they're a perfect example of how appearances can be deceiving.
Yeah.
I mean, the females are bigger than the males.
Yeah.
They're more aggressive, and they're the ones in charge.
Yeah. Total girl power.
Yeah. For a long time, people thought that their masculine traits must be because of all this testosterone.
Right. Like those super high levels.
Yeah. But it turns out that's not the whole story.
No, it gets more interesting.
What is going on with those hyena females?
Well, researchers did find high levels of testosterone in pregnant hyenas,
Uh-huh.
but it wasn't regular testosterone. It's androstenedione.
Androstenedione, okay.
And it gets converted into testosterone, but in the placenta.
Oh, wow.
So it's actually the developing female fetus that gets this testosterone surge.
And that's what causes the masculinized features.
Exactly. So it's not just about testosterone being present or absent. It's about the timing and the context.
So it's more complicated than just testosterone equals male.
Way more complicated. And it really challenges those old ideas about how sex development works, like that organizational concept.
The organizational concept.
Yeah, the one that basically says that male development is driven by testosterone.
Okay.
And female development is just the passive default, like whatever happens when there's no testosterone.
Oh, so it's like saying testosterone makes you male, and if you don't have it, you're automatically female.
Yeah, something like that. But the hyena totally throws a wrench in that theory.
It seems like the more we learn about this stuff, the less straightforward it all becomes.
Right. It's a lot more nuanced than we used to think.
Mm-hmm.
And it highlights how important it is to keep questioning those old assumptions.
Definitely. So where does that leave us?
Well, I think it points to a bigger shift that's happening in how we understand sex development.
Okay.
We're starting to move beyond these simplistic models and appreciate the complexity of it all. And one thing that's become really clear is that we can't ignore the ovaries.
The ovaries. We haven't really talked about this much.
I know, right? For so long, they were kind of seen as these passive egg factories.
Okay.
But they're actually active players in the development of female animals. They require specific genes and hormones to function properly.
So they're just as important as the testes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're just as complex. It's not a simple either situation.
This is blowing my mind. It's like we're rewriting the textbook on sex determination right here.
I know, it's exciting, right? But speaking of the textbooks, I have to ask, is it really as simple as XX for female and XY for male?
Uh-huh. You probably already know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, buckle up, because it turns out there's a whole orchestra of genes involved, not just the ones on the sex chromosomes.
Oh, wow. So it's not just those X and Y chromosomes calling the shots.
Nope. We're talking about a network of around 60 genes scattered all over the genome.
60 genes? That's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And they all play a role in how sex is determined. But I know what you're thinking.
What about that famous SRY gene?
Ah, yes, the SRY gene.
The one that supposedly flipped the switch to make an embryo male.
Right. And it's definitely important in humans. But here's the thing. It's not the universal answer to sex determination.
Okay, so other animals do things differently.
Totally differently. Some animals have different systems entirely, and sometimes sex isn't even determined by genes at all.
Wait, seriously? You're telling me some animals can become male or female based on something other than their genes?
Yep. Things like temperature, sunlight, even social cues can play a role.
Okay, now you have to tell me more about this. What could possibly influence something as fundamental as sex?
Well, think about turtles, for example. The temperature of the nest where the eggs are laid actually determines whether they'll hatch as male or female.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like nature is constantly surprising us.
I know, right? It's amazing how many different ways there are to solve the problem of reproduction. And that brings us to a truly mind-bending concept.
Okay, what is it?
Sex reversal.
Sex reversal? What's that?
It's exactly what it sounds like. Some animals can actually change their sex.
Whoa, really? That seems wild, like something out of science fiction.
It is pretty wild.
Yeah.
But it's definitely real. And Cooke introduces us to this scientist, Nicholas Rodriguez.
Okay.
And he studies common frogs.
Common frogs. They can change their sex.
Well, it's not quite that simple. It turns out these frogs have 3 different sex races, each with its own way of determining sex.
3 different ways?
Yeah. Some follow that typical XY system. Others are all XX and have their sex determined by temperature.
Like the turtles.
Exactly. But then there are these frogs in the middle range, and they have a mix of XY females, XX males, and even individuals with both ovarian and testicular tissue.
Whoa, that's incredible. So you could have a frog that's genetically male but develops as female.
Exactly. And vice versa.
Yeah.
It's a really cool example of how sex is way more flexible and adaptable than we usually give it credit for.
It makes you wonder if these animals can change their sex so easily. What does that mean for how we understand sex in humans?
That's a great question, and one that we'll definitely explore further in our deep dive.
Okay, folks, you heard it here. We're just getting started on this fascinating journey into the world of females and nature. Make sure you stick around for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into these mind-boggling discoveries.
It's going to be wild.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into this fascinating world of female animals.
Yeah, last time we were talking about frogs that could switch sexes.
Yeah, those crazy frogs. It's mind-boggling how nature just throws all those old assumptions about male and female right out the window.
Totally. And I think it all leads to this idea that to really understand sex, we need to think about it in a whole new way.
Okay, so how should we be thinking about it?
Well, remember that scientist David Cruz? He came up with this concept of the 5 types of sex.
Yeah, the 5 types of sex. I remember that. It seemed like a really important idea, but I don't think we really got into what those 5 types actually are.
Yeah, right. So he basically says that instead of thinking of sex as just one thing, we need to think about it as having 5 different layers.
5 layers?
Yeah, so there's chromosomal sex.
Okay.
Then there's gonadal sex, hormonal sex, morphological sex, and behavioral sex.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot. Chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, morphological, and behavioral. Did I get that right?
You got it.
Okay, so those are the 5 types of sex, according to Cruz. But how do they all fit together?
Well, the thing is, they don't always fit together neatly.
What do you mean?
Like, you can have an animal that's chromosomally male, but hormonally female. Or morphologically female, but behaviorally male.
So like those frogs with the mismatched chromosomes and gonads.
Exactly. And the hyenas, too. They're chromosomally female, but they develop these really masculine traits because of that testosterone surge they get in the womb.
Right, and what about those Jane Andromorphs? I mean, they're basically like 2 sexes in one body.
Yeah. Gynandromorphs are a really fascinating example of how these different layers of sex can be expressed in different ways, even within a single individual. It's like nature is showing off all the possibilities.
So it's not just about whether you're male or female, it's about how those different layers of sex interact and express themselves.
Exactly. And what's even more mind-blowing is that those layers can be influenced by all sorts of things, not just genes.
Like what?
We already talked about how temperature can determine sex in some animals. But things like social cues, food availability, even exposure to pollutants can have an impact on how those different layers of sex develop.
Wow, so it's this incredibly complex interplay of nature and nurture.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it means that sex is way more fluid and dynamic than we usually think. It's not this fixed binary thing. It's more like a spectrum with all sorts of variations and possibilities.
Okay, so we're starting to get a handle on this idea of the 5 types of sex.
Yep.
But there's another really interesting point that Cooke makes in her book that I wanted to touch on. It's about the evolution of sex.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she brings up this idea that maybe females were actually the ancestral sex.
What? Like females came first and then males evolved later.
That's what she's suggesting. It sounds crazy at first.
It kind of does, yeah.
But when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it kind of makes sense.
So how does it make sense?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, females are the ones who produce those big, nutrient-rich egg cells. And in many species, they're also the ones who invest more time and energy in caring for the offspring.
Right.
So in a way, it makes sense that the female reproductive strategy might be the more ancient one.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like the foundation upon which the male strategy evolved.
Exactly. And it really challenges those traditional assumptions about the roles of males and females in evolution. But speaking of challenging assumptions, I think it's time to bring birds into the mix.
Oh, yeah. Birds. Can't forget about them.
They've got their own unique way of doing things when it comes to sex determination.
They sure do. No XX and XY for these feathered friends.
So how do birds do it? What's their system?
It's called the ZW system. It's basically the opposite of the XY system.
The opposite? What do you mean?
So in birds, it's the females who have 2 different sex chromosomes, ZW.
Okay.
And the males have 2 of the same, ZZ.
Wow, so it's like nature flipped the script on us.
Exactly. And it means that the SRY gene, the one that kicks off tests development in mammals, isn't involved in birds at all. They have their own set of genes that control sex determination.
So once again, we see that there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to sex. Evolution has come up with all sorts of creative solutions.
Totally. And the birds are a perfect example of that. But, we've been talking a lot about how sex is determined, but what about how those differences actually develop?
Like, how do you go from having XX or XY chromosomes to actually developing male or female characteristics?
Right. And that's where those gynandromorphs come back into play. They can teach us a lot about how those sex differences actually arise.
Yeah, remember that gynandromorph zebra finch we talked about earlier? The one with the male song circuit on one side of its brain and the female song circuit on the other?
Yeah, that one was amazing. And it really challenges this old idea that hormones are the only thing that shape those differences between male and female brains.
So it's not just about being bathed in testosterone or estrogen. It's about what's happening in each individual cell.
Exactly. And it seems like those genes on the sex chromosomes are playing a much more direct role than we previously thought. They're actually influencing how the brain develops, independent of the hormones.
So it's this incredibly complex interplay of genes and hormones all working together to shake those sex differences.
Exactly. And I think this is a perfect example of how those 5 types of sex that Cruz talked about can all interact and influence each other. It's not a simple linear process. It's a complex, dynamic system.
It's really amazing how much we still have to learn about sex and gender. And it makes you wonder, with all this diversity in the animal kingdom, what does it mean for us humans?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? How does all of this relate to our own species?
And I guess that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll explore the complexities of human sex development and what all of this means for how we think about sex and gender in our own society. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of females and nature. We've covered so much ground already.
I know, right? From moles to hyenas, frogs that change sex, and even birds with split brains. It's like nature's just constantly rewriting the rule book.
Yeah, and all this amazing stuff we've been talking about, It really makes you think about what it means to be male or female.
Yeah, it challenges those traditional categories for sure.
And it raises so many questions about our own species, too. I mean, we're animals, right? So how does all of this diversity we're seeing in the natural world apply to us?
That's a great question. And it's one that Cooke really tackles head-on in her book.
Yeah. What does she say about it?
Well, she basically argues that we humans tend to oversimplify sex.
Yeah.
We think of it as this either era thing, male or female, and we assume that it's determined by your chromosomes.
XX or XY.
Right, but as we've seen in the animal kingdom, it's just not that simple. There are all these other factors at play: genes, hormones, environment, even chance.
So human sex development is more complicated than just those X and Y chromosomes.
Way more complicated. And one of the key things to understand is that those different levels of sex that we talked about earlier don't always line up perfectly.
Okay, remind me again, what were those 5 types of sex?
Chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, morphological, and behavioral.
Right. Okay, so those don't always match up.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of variations in how sex develops. And that's what we see in intersex people.
Right, intersex variations. Cooke talks about this a lot in her book. It was eye-opening to learn how common these variations actually are.
It is, right. Something like 1 in 50 people is born with some kind of intersex variation. So it's not this rare abnormal thing. It's a natural part of human diversity.
And it really challenges this idea that there's one right way to be male or female.
Absolutely. It shows that human biology is a spectrum, not a set of rigid categories. And I think that's a really powerful message.
Definitely. So we've talked about genes and chromosomes, but what about hormones?
Hormones, the chemical messengers of the body. They play a huge role in sex development.
Yeah, and we tend to think of testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen as the female hormone.
Right, that's the typical story. Yeah. But as with everything else we've been discussing, it's not quite that simple.
So what's the real story when it comes to hormones?
Well, one really interesting point that Cooke makes is that estrogen might actually be the ancestral hormone.
What does that mean?
So estrogen, the hormone we usually associate with female development, might have actually been around long before testosterone evolved.
Whoa, so estrogen is like the OG hormone.
That's what some scientists think. And it makes sense when you consider that estrogen is essential for both male and female reproductive systems. It's involved in everything from bone growth to brain development.
So both men and women need estrogen to function properly.
Exactly. It's not just a female hormone. It's crucial for everyone.
This is all so fascinating. It's like with every new piece of information, the picture of sex and gender becomes more complex and more nuanced.
It definitely does. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about science. It's a constant process of discovery, of challenging our assumptions, and of expanding our understanding of the world.
I couldn't agree more. So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway from all of this mind-bending information?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that sex and gender are way more complicated and diverse than we often realize, and that diversity is something to be celebrated, not feared or ignored.
I love that. Embrace the complexity, celebrate the diversity. It's like nature's giving us a masterclass in open-mindedness.
Exactly. And I think if we can take that lesson to heart, it can only lead to a more compassionate and just world for everyone.
I couldn't agree more. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the amazing world of females in nature.
Yeah.
It's been an incredible journey, and we've covered so much ground. From those mind-boggling moles with their egg and testosterone-producing organs, to those powerful hyena matriarchs, to those gender-bending frogs and birds, we've seen how nature constantly pushes the boundaries of what we thought was possible.
It's really made us rethink those traditional categories of male and female.
Yeah, and it's challenged us to embrace complexity and to see the beauty in diversity. And ultimately, I think it's given us a whole new appreciation for the incredible creativity and resilience of life on our planet.
And for the power of science to help us understand it all.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us on this amazing adventure. We hope you've learned something new, challenged some assumptions, and maybe even left with a little bit of awe and wonder.
And who knows, maybe this is just the beginning of your own deep dive into the fascinating world of biology and beyond.
Keep those minds open and keep exploring.